Chapter 4. Oriana's head hurt. This had to be the least comfortable bed ever. She lifted her hand to check the back of her head and felt a large bump. Even with her eyes open, it was completely dark. She sat up against the wall, listening. The only sound was her breathing. She wiped the sweat from her face with her sleeve and stood up slowly with the wall as support. By running her hands around the wall, she was able to find the lift door. Then, to one side, she found the buttons, but none glowed at her touch. She moved over to the communication panel. It also remained dark. She slid down to the floor with her back against the wall across from the door. Everyone will be so worried. Gemma moved along the rows of occupied beds. Her staff had everything under control. She went to her office and fell into her chair. She tapped the communication panel that stood up from the desk. "Dr. Gemma Fiore quarters," she commanded. The lights on the panel told her that the panel in her quarters would be sounding. After a minute, with no response, the computer stopped sending the signal and the panel on her desk went dark again. She stood, then left her office. She stopped the first nurse she saw. "I'm going to check on Oriana. Call if I'm needed." "Yes, ma'am." Gemma hurried to her quarters. As soon as the door slid open, she yelled, "Oriana!" There was no response. She went to Oriana's room. It was empty. She checked her own bedroom, but it was empty as well. She tapped the communicator on her arm as she went back out into the corridor. "Inoa Kahele quarters." Inoa's voice came to her earpiece. "Have you seen Oriana since the attack started?" "No, she hasn't come to me. What's wrong?" "She isn't in my quarters or the infirmary. Where could she be?" "We'll find her. Perhaps the officers' mess?" "Good idea. I'll check there." When she entered the officers' mess, Chief Mathis and Joseph stopped their work of putting the chairs back in their places from where they had been thrown about the room. "I'm sorry, Dr. Fiore. We won't be ready to serve for a while," said Mathis. "I'm actually looking for Oriana. Have you seen her, Joseph?" The blood drained from Joseph's face as she watched him. "She isn't in your quarters?" "No, and she isn't in the infirmary or with Inoa." I took her to see the chief's gardens, and that's where we were when the all hands sounded. She said she knew the way, but I should have brought her back to you. Damn it!" He slammed his fist on the table. "Ensign!" Mathis yelled. "I'm sorry, sir, but it's my fault that she's lost in the ship somewhere. She could be hurt. May I be dismissed to help search for her?" Chief Mathis frowned at Joseph. He looked at Gemma. "He's yours until the girl is found." "Thank you, Chief." Joseph followed Gemma out into the corridor. "We should start at the storage bay since that's where you saw her last." Along the way, Gemma recruited everyone she saw doing something non-essential. When they reached the storage bay, she had a group of 20 people with her. They spread out through the room. After a couple of hours of searching the enormous bay, they returned to where they began. "You all looked everywhere? Even underneath the platforms?" Joseph's voice rose to a higher pitch. Everyone nodded and confirmed they had searched everywhere. Gemma put a hand on his shoulder. "We'll worry about blame later. Right now, you need to stay calm." She turned to the group assembled around them. "We'll spread out and search this deck. Each time we reach a split in the corridor, we'll split the group in half. Open every door, including the lifts. She was trying to return to my quarters or the infirmary. If you find anything, let me know." She pointed to the communications unit on her wrist to emphasize this. Everyone went into the hall. Gemma split the group in half, with Joseph in one group and herself in the other. Each group headed in an opposite direction down the corridor. Joseph's group reached several intersections, and each time he divided the group. Soon he was walking alone through the corridors. He opened each door he came to, but there was no sign of Oriana. He stopped in front of the steel plate of a temporary bulkhead that had sealed off the corridor beyond. It meant a breach on the other side. His stomach dropped, and he felt sick. "She wasn't there," he assured himself. He turned around and retraced his steps to the last intersection he came across. He followed it to a corridor that was lit only by emergency lights. She must be terrified wherever she is. Come on, Joe, where would she go? Right or left? He turned right down the dim corridor, but he was stopped before long by another temporary bulkhead. He turned around and followed it back the other way. He opened a door on a storage bay. Oriana, are you in here? There was no answer. He entered the room and walked around the large crates of supplies. Not here. He ran his hand over his short hair and resisted the urge to scream. He returned to the corridor and continued searching each room. He was stopped by a lift door that wouldn't open. Of course not. No power. He started to turn away when something drew him back. What was that? He stood still, listening. He was sure he had heard something. Tapping. He turned back to the lift door and pressed his ear against it. The sound was coming from inside the lift. He ran down the corridor and skid to a stop in front of the first communication panel he found. He tapped it. Gemma Fiore, he said, barely keeping his voice steady. Fiore, her voice came through the speaker. Dr. Fiore, it's Joseph. I think I've found her. At least, I found someone trapped in a lift here. There's no power to it. He gave the location, then ran back to the lift door. He pounded on the outside of the door and yelled, We're going to get you out! He pressed his hand on the door panel again, though he knew it was futile with no power running to the lift. He stepped back from the door. What was it they taught us in academy? He clenched his fists. Come on, stupid, you can remember. There, the outline of the service panel close to the floor beside the door. He dropped to his knees, then sat down on the floor to get as low as he could. It was barely visible. He felt along it and found the release. It popped open. The space behind was filled with wires, switches, electronic boards, and chips plugged into slots. Oh no. Just then, Dr. Fiore and several others came running down the corridor. He stood up and moved out of the way. One of the men dropped to his knees in front of the panel and started fiddling with the stuff inside. I'm glad you got here. I have no idea what I'm looking at there. Dr. Fiore placed a hand on his shoulder. It's okay. I feel the same way about that stuff. Joseph shifted his weight back and forth. He stood in front of the lift door. His hands were clenched up in fists. He was barely aware of the doctor and the other people gathered around the door. Suddenly, the door slid open just a fraction. Joseph leaped forward and forced it open further. Hot air escaped into the corridor. She's here! Joseph squeezed through the gap he had created and dropped to the floor next to Oriana. She lay on the floor on her side with her eyes closed. The gray tunic was soaked in sweat. He gently rolled her to her back. Her chest lifted slightly but rapidly. She's breathing, but she's unconscious. It's ungodly hot in here. The door moved bit by bit, opening wider. Joseph carefully lifted Oriana in his arms and brought her into the corridor. Let's get her to my infirmary. Dr. Fiore brushed a stray lock of hair out of Oriana's face before she started walking rapidly down the corridor. Joseph followed, with Oriana cradled in his arms. Oriana felt cool air on her face. There was softness beneath her back, a beeping sound, a hissing sound, antiseptic scents, and her hand enclosed by something. She opened her eyes to the white curtain, bed, and machines of the infirmary. Her right hand was being held by Joseph, who was sitting on a stool beside the bed. His head drooped with his chin against his chest, and his eyes were closed. An IV line was running to her arm. She followed the tube up to the bag and saw from the label that it was just fluids. Joseph? His head came up. Oriana, I'm sorry. I should never have left you alone. It isn't your fault I got lost. I wasn't paying attention close enough when we went down there. Then when the red lights came on, I couldn't make out the color of the stripes and symbols. Oh, wow. I didn't even think of that. I'm sorry I made everyone worry. Joseph sat there with his mouth hanging open for a moment. You didn't do anything wrong. It was my job to make sure you were safe. Gemma came around the curtain. Look at you two trying to take the blame. She shook her head and laughed. We had quite a scare when we couldn't find you, but it certainly isn't your fault, and we aren't blaming Joseph either. She walked over to the IV solution and clamped it off. You're okay to return to my quarters as long as Joseph makes sure you get there." "Yes, ma'am." Joseph shot to his feet. Gemma carefully removed the IV from Oriana's arm and placed a small bandage over the spot. "I'll contact Chief Mathis and let him know that you need a day, Ensign. See that you use it wisely." She tilted her head in Oriana's direction. "Yes, ma'am." Gemma left them alone in the curtained cubicle. Oriana slid off the bed. She put a hand to her head as she wobbled a little. Joseph steadied her with a hand under her elbow. "Are you okay?" "Yes, I just got up too fast." "Well, let's take it slow and get you to your own bed." He kept one hand cupped under her elbow and guided her out of the infirmary. Oriana's steps became steadier as she walked. Even so, he kept his hand under her arm until they reached Gemma's quarters. Oriana pressed her palm to the plate to open the door. Joseph followed her inside. "I feel sticky," Oriana said. "I'm going to wash up." "I'll be right here." Joseph sat on one of the chairs and stretched out his long legs. The lights were dim when Oriana woke up. She felt the warmth of Joseph through her clothing. His arms still enclosed her as she sat on his lap in the armchair with her head resting on his chest. She breathed in his scent of soap, sweat, and something she could only define as Joseph. She tried to stay still, but he yawned and opened his eyes. "Hey, you," he smiled, and Oriana felt her heart flutter. "Guess I fell asleep too." He brushed a stray hair out of her face. "How are you feeling?" "Oh, I'm fine." She rested her head back on his chest. She felt as well as heard his laughter through her ear pressed against him. Joseph squeezed her gently and kissed the top of her head. The door slid open, and Gemma stopped just inside the doorway. She was frowning at Joseph. "We slept, Dr. Fiore. That's it." Gemma's expression softened, and she shook her head. She fell into the other armchair. One after the other, she pulled her boots off and dropped them to the floor. With a sigh, she leaned back into the chair. "The captain is pretty angry about nearly losing our passenger. I convinced him that it was an innocent mistake. There won't be any consequences, but let's keep wanderings to a minimum." "Yes, ma'am," Joseph said. "He's also plotting a course for Izanagi. It's the nearest coalition planet with a fleet dock where Chicago can receive repairs." "And he's ordering Oriana off, isn't he?" Joseph asked. Oriana sat up on his lap, her heart clenched. "It's a good place to start over," Gemma said. "I love having you here, Oriana, but the fleet isn't going to allow you to stay on board without good reason." Joseph rubbed Oriana's back. "I've been to Izanagi before. It's a pretty decent world and has a great university in New Tokyo, the capital. It was a top pick of my father." "Why didn't you go to university?" Gemma asked. "Because that's what my father wanted me to do," Joseph chuckled. "Honestly, I hate studying. I'm no good in school. I decided to join fleet when the recruiter came around to school. My father forbade it, but I enlisted anyway. Then he pulled strings to make sure I ended up in the kitchens." He shrugged. "I still won." They sat in silence for a moment. Then Joseph said, "Hey, when can Oriana get this cast off her arm?" He pointed to her left arm. "Soon, I think. We'll do a scan of it tomorrow and see how it's healing. The treatments went very well, so it usually only takes a couple of weeks for the bone to heal enough to remove the cast." "That's good news. It would suck to be on a new planet with a cast on your arm." "Did anyone else get hurt in the attack? Who attacked us?" Oriana asked. "I don't have the full briefing yet, but from what I've heard, the theory is that it's the same marauders that attacked your colony," Gemma said. Oriana felt her muscles go stiff. The blood drained from her face. "There were plenty of minor injuries, and the attackers did manage to board through a breach, but the Marines stopped them without any deaths on our side. They had 0G fighters. I heard that we've brought in some debris from those, but the battleship escaped." "Wow, I hadn't heard any of that, but then I'm stuck in engines for all hands. And then we were searching for you." Joseph tapped the tip of Oriana's nose with his finger. "All right, you two. It's been a long day. You both need your rest. Doctor's orders. We'll see you at breakfast, Ensign." "Yes, ma'am." Oriana slid off Joseph's lap, then he stood. He leaned down and kissed her cheek, then hugged her tightly. "I'll see you at breakfast," he said. Then he stepped back and walked out of the room into the hall. Oriana stood in the middle of the room, staring at the closed door until Gemma cleared her throat. She spun around while her ears burned. Gemma laughed. Your emotions are easy to read, dear. He's a good man, though, and he likes you. But why? I'm so fat and ugly. Oriana looked down at the floor. I'm sure he just felt sorry for me. I'm going to be leaving after all. Oriana, look at me. Oriana looked up at Gemma, though it was reluctantly. You are not ugly, and you aren't fat either. Comparing yourself to others will always make you unhappy. I once thought I was too thin, too tall. Don't overthink it. He likes you. Thank you, Gemma. Now go get some sleep.